Okay, you guys. I wanted to give you an update on how the background painting is going. Well, some good news. I finished it. It took me about 2 nights to be able to get this thing done, and each session was about, I don't know, 6 hours or so. So, in the previous videos, I've gone through composition, line work, blocking in the initial colors, thinking about the color spaces, that type of stuff, getting my general ideas together. And there ended up being a pretty big jump between the where I left off in the videos versus the final piece. And so I wanted to go through and talk to you guys about the final piece and how this actually came together. So there we go. That's what the final looks like. And yeah, it's pretty different from the last time that you saw it. So there's a lot of little tricks that I'm doing here that I wanted to go through and talk to you guys about, and a lot of polish and detail stuff that's going on. The biggest part that you'll see when it comes to this composition is that I've really gone through and I've worked the color space quite a bit. I always knew that I wanted this particular area here to be the focus of the piece. So I knew that I wanted this to be the brightest spot within the composition to pull the viewer's eyes in. But I was having a lot of trouble with these trees in this particular area that weren't getting dark enough to be able to push forward. And there was too much competing that was going on between this sort of overhang cliff that the snake statue is peeking out from and this top section up here. So I had to go in and I had to darken all this stuff quite a bit. I also had to make some big choices about how I was going to do the lighting and pushing this over. And all of this has helped to really kind of make this painting, I think, come together and work pretty successfully at the end. I've also reworked the waterfall quite a bit. So one thing that I like to do when I get a painting to this stage in class is show you guys kind of what's going on with dropping back the layers. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to talk you through kind of what my thought process is here while I'm building this stuff up so that we can see it from the end and understand sort of what the mechanics are happening here. So these top layers within this section, I'm going to go ahead and guess most of this is going to be lighting and finalizing details. So yeah, you can see right here on layer 70, I've got one little extra highlight that's coming in behind that tree. And that really helps a lot to be able to explain where this light is happening and what's going on there to be able to brighten this whole section up so much. Without that, it just feels like it's sort of missing something, right? And then from there, you got a whole bunch of yellow highlights. This one is set to vivid light, and it's a pretty bright yellow overlay that I'm using here. That's sort of like almost like a wash if you're doing oil paints or acrylics. It's just kind of glazing over it to give it a little bit more yellow tone within some, or warmness within the spots that I actually want you to look at and focus on. And this works in contrast to the white that's going on within the top of the background. It helps to differentiate it just a little bit more. Without that, you can see that the highlights are still there. They're all the same kind of color space, but it's not pulling the viewer's eye in quite the same way. So now we've got that first highlight, the big block of yellow from here. More mist. All right. So within this bottom section here, I felt like, yeah, it was dark enough and it was handling the job of doing the shadows well, but it didn't really see. I've got a little bit more mist going on with that area too. So I'm sort of softening some of these areas of super strong contrast so that I can get over to the brights. And what this is doing also is just sort of deadening a lot of those details that are within here, so there's less contrast within them. So this goes back to that rule of 30-70, where I've got 30% of my picture that I really want people to be able to focus on, which is the highest layers of points of contrast within the piece that are happening on the snake's head right now. And this is just removing some of that contrast that's going on within the shadowed area. And again, helping to push the viewer's eyes to where I want them to look. After that, quick little details on the waterfall, just trying to redo my highlight. That one's kind of boring. More subtle work on the waterfall. This is the waterfall without the mist, so you can see that misty stuff that's in there. We do have some well-detailed, well-painted rocks This is a great lesson. Sometimes you got to, let it go. I have a real bad habit whenever I'm doing these paintings, because I come from like a sketch drawing background, to almost want to like draw in all the details as if I was like drawing it with like markers or pens. And so digital painting really helps me a lot to be able to go in and leave some of these details behind. Say, okay, that stuff looks cool, but it looks a little bit better when this whole area is just getting that fog and adding that atmospheric perspective. Yep. So that one, I don't even know. Some kind of small highlight. There we go. Just doing more work on the waterfall. Okay, so this next one, there's my update to the waterfall. Again, just trying to shape it up better, get rid of some of those really bright highlights down here since there's no light that's hitting it. The super bright highlight wasn't really working for me anymore, so I wanted to deaden that a little bit. And that streak going through the waterfall that I did early on was distracting and wasn't really helping the composition at all. And it didn't make sense with the shadow being cast by the snake's head. So that's this white strip right here. So I want to go in and just thinking about it deeper from a lighting perspective. So this is a really cool one that I wanted to be able to show you guys, and this is where I started to make a lot of these sort of final polished decisions within my piece. So I've been working from my reference images this entire time, looking at the lighting, pulling my colors, trying to get a sense of how to be able to bend the light to be able to make what the brightest area I want is. Now I can go in and I can check this. What I did was I flattened all my layers by going to like layer, flatten image, copied, pasted it on a new layer, turned it to black and white. I set it to hard light. So this is what it looks like without the hard light on there, right? It's still working. It's essentially still the same painting, but you can see how much more the snake's face sort of pops up right there. And then the background edges start to vignette a little bit more, and they become quite a bit darker. So all this stuff within the extreme foreground starts to darken up and, become less important. The way that I'm doing this, it's set to hard light from a black and white layer. Let me show you what the black and white layer looks like. So I'm turning this on to normal, and let's go all the way up with it. There we go. So now we are looking at the painting in black and white. And this is such a cool step as you start to move into polish at the very end, because it allows you to be able to see what's really working here. When I first did this to the image, there really wasn't enough contrast on the snake's face. It wasn't pushed close enough to white for it to really stand out in a black and white image. Same thing goes for these pieces on the edge here. There just wasn't enough contrast happening. So what I ended up doing was taking the burn tool around a lot of these areas and darkening them up even more than I was comfortable doing working with all the colors. So I had the basic composition, I had my color space, I had all that stuff, but there's still some small pushing that needed to happen with the darks and lights to really be able to focus the viewer's attention and eye within this area. And then going back and working on that, setting it to the hard light, whatever. Yeah, this is what it looked like. So beforehand and then now. So essentially the same thing, but there's still just too many lights going on within some of these areas. And, you got to let some of this stuff go so that I can push the part that's really important to me forward within the composition. See, it just feels a little bit more flat. That's happening here. So this is kind of a neat thing as we move down into past the polishing stage, and this is me going in and detailing now within the piece. Those are my reference images. Okay, so I've got some more little streaks of light that I'm starting to build in here. I thought this one was really important because I like the way that this line, this really light highlight, starts to cut the piece and direct the viewer's attention down to our snake, and it's just a really small, strong kind of graphical line that's happening within this space. My waterfall before, yeah, it looks good. It's bright, nice and bright, but again, it's away from where I want the viewer to actually look. It was hurting the composition to take their attention that far down to the bottom of the piece. So I wanted to go in and just deaden that waterfall. Yes, your eyes still know that it's a waterfall, but it doesn't help you all that much. Okay, so now some of those big choices when it comes to the lighting. I wanted this cliff to really feel like it was cutting off the light that's on the right-hand side, as if you can imagine this ridge moving all the way around. And so, yeah, I was painting these bushes, trying to get them to work, trying to add more little detail within there. You can see, I'll zoom in real quick. Oh man, I just painted all types of different plants and really tried to get this this thick jungle brush kind of feel going on with it, but it wasn't doing the job. It wasn't doing what I needed it to do to feel like a shadow within there. And again, it's all about building the contrast to this snake's head. So I want to drop this stuff back, let it be in the shadows. It's still got a good color space that works. It's a little bit lighter than what's going on within the stuff within the extreme foreground. Okay. Cool. So this next one is just going through detail pass. So I'm continuing to work these rocks, and I'm making choices along the way, right? So you can see without this, yeah, the rocks work. There's some interesting shading that's happening within this space. I like the little color dots that I'm getting and some of the highlights, and it's starting to inform me about what's going on with the lighting over on the far left-hand side. But as I turn it back on, you can see that I'm starting to make some big decisions here. So this rock didn't really have a lot of form or shape, and it wasn't matching up with the right hand side with how dark I've gone over there. So I wanted to darken it up. I wanted to push some of those highlights for it catching the light just within a little bit of space, and I didn't want to overdo it over here. So it's just 1, 2, and very, very small minuscule lights that are happening over on this side. Kind of a cool layer. All right, from there, continuing to build up more of that algae and more of the general shapes, helping to define those rocks over on the side, getting a little bit more of the shadows in there. Right, and even at this stage, without that turned on, it's still a cool looking painting of sort of a 2-3 value rock system that's happening over there. So same deal. This is me making some big choices about how to go in and darken up this underside area. I'd pushed it darker and darker and darker before and just wasn't really sure how deep to be able to take this, but I felt like the shape size of this whole little section here compared to the size of the snake, I wanted the snake to be the brightest, so I knew that this, if it was just sort of a medium tone, wasn't really going to work all that well. It needed to be quite a bit darker for where the shadows are actually coming in. And yeah, I was kind of in love with, you know, the idea of putting a root system and all this other stuff underneath this rocky cliff to match this rocky cliff over here. But in the end, you know, you got to let some of this stuff go because the painting was just becoming sort of white noise and too busy to be able to look at. And this helped me to be able to, again, keep that focus on this area by darkening it up and adding more contrast visually on the canvas between these two spaces. Same deal. This is me darkening it up even more. Trying to get rid of some of that those high areas contrast. You can see right here, yeah, it looks cool for the bottom of a cliff face, but it's just too busy in comparison to what's going on here. We've got a bunch of tight little dots of color, and the same thing is happening over here. So I needed to be able to mute that to where it still arrives, but just going even deeper with it. Now it looks right. Isn't that crazy how that works, right? So getting some small little highlights on there, still trying to work and think through it. Yeah, so this is what it looked like before. You can see that that cliff face is totally disappearing. It's competing too much with what's going on with the underside of the snake. And this is, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4 layers of me trying to push that shading further and get more contrast within that space. So these were some big decisions that were happening right here. Same thing. So here's my polish and detail pass on this front tree. Previously, that's what I had for my initial sketch and my blocking in of my colors and working through the darks and lights to give me an idea of where to go. After I go through my darks and lights, that first pass, then I can go through and I can start making some choices about what the final pass or detail pass is going to look like on my tree. So this is a really, really strong example of that. Let's get these layers over here. Let's focus on this right-hand side. Same deal. So we can see that all of a sudden those trees start to get little highlights, start to work my way through the bark just a little bit more, trying to give it some moss and give it just a little bit more color space because again, this is a jungle. Everything has got something, some kind of other creature or plant life that's growing on it and trying to take it over. Ooh, that's a big one. Wow. Yeah, so there's my dark pass on that foliage. Now we can see that this one's called foreground trees. That's where I was when I had my blocking shapes within there. So go ahead and turn that guy off too. Oh, this is a cool one. So this is set to hard light 77%. Again, when I'm starting to work through the lighting, when I was going through and detailing this piece, I really started on the top right-hand side. I felt like I needed to, I mentioned in the previous video, working from the back to the front. And these trees just had too much contrast. There wasn't enough darkness going on within the tree up here. But I knew that if I could get some interesting lighting effects and start the light pouring through the trees over here, that, you know, I'd be onto something. And I really like the way that the foliage built up within this section. I'm going to leave the foreground trees on for now so we can kind of see where I was in the previous painting. All right, so again, that's just turning off those light beams. This is kind of cool. So with the light, I wanted to make sure, since I've got my, you know, far background light sky color here, that for the tops of these trees, this is something that, you know, a lot of times when you're working with these, it really is sort of a push and pull, and I'm looking down at my navigator and seeing these big areas of darkness that are happening and trying to find a good balance between how this lighting's working, what the intensity of the lighting is. So I really did a lot of work within this tree, this leaf space right here, trying to get these not to feel too contrasty on the scene, so that there's still an area of darkness, but I needed the light to be able to hit it in kind of a cool and interesting way, or to make it feel like the light is actually illuminating and breaking through the tops. So yeah, that's what's going on there. You can see it hits every part of the canopy of that tree. It starts to come through some of those shadows too. So there's a lot that's going on with that light. It's not just that one beam hitting this tree over here on the right-hand side. All right, so building up leaf forms. There were 2 videos for the introduction of this. You can type into YouTube if you forgot about them and say how to draw trees or how to paint trees digitally. And that's just sort of the techniques that I'm using here. So I'm going through on all of my leaves. This is my super highlight layer. Right, so you can see that I start off with very sort of blocky shapes in the beginning of it, and I've got good contrast happening. And then for my highest point of contrast, I want to go in here. You can see how this tree within this middle left-hand side of the screen isn't really showing up. It's not really appearing in any kind of way, but by adding those extra leaves on it, it really helps to push it forward. Same thing happens with these leaves right in here. That tree was totally disappearing. You don't even notice it, but now it becomes much easier to see. Another interesting thing that's going on is this tree, this bushel of leaves over here on the left-hand side. I was thinking about, you know, how dark that was getting, especially at the back side of it. And if it's a smaller bushel of leaves, they're not going to be able to keep the light out that much. There's still going to be light that's penetrating through it. Yes, you can have some dark colors on the inside, but for the most part, I needed to brighten that up quite a bit. Isn't it crazy seeing all this stuff get turned on and off? Yeah, so that works a lot better instead of it being so dark. Same thing was kind of bothering me with this whole canopy section here. It felt really dark in contrast to what was going on under here. And then there was a bunch of issues that I had to go in and fix and tighten up. Okay, so there's some more highlights on our bushes. Yeah, there we go. So middle treetops. With that same layer, I went through and you can see that I painted a lot more fauna and, well, bushes throughout the rest of the painting. Here's what it was looking like before. So I knew I wanted some bush space that was going on over here, some foliage and things that were cropping and growing out of this section. But this big grassy knoll that was happening, it looked a little bit odd. It was just too blank. And because it was so blank compared to the noise of the rest of the piece, it wasn't helping you to be able to focus on the snake. The two were kind of competing against one another. So I wanted to add more busyness, more noise, and I had to lower the value and the contrast of this section as well, so that it wouldn't pop as much as the snake statue or the snake ruins. Okay, so I'm gonna leave that layer up just so that we can see what's going on with it. From here, this is me starting to push in on that shadow section over there. So just want to add a little bit more to it. Yeah, so there's my highlights on all those bushes that I created in the top right-hand side. You can see me just working through those. I know that the light's going to come from the right-hand side, so I'm trying to think, okay, if these plants are peeking up into the air, where they're going to be hitting highlights. You can see all the dark colors that I have going on underneath here, and really how much this entire cliff face has changed now that we're starting to remove a lot of these layers. All right, so goodbye highlights. There's my middle tones for the trees. So this is me. Okay, the way that you can see this is I'm going through and I'm blocking it in with just sort of a flat color, right, on all these darks. And then from there, I can go in and I'm going to add my middle tones, right? So that's where the highlights are starting to hit. And then I've got my extreme highlights that are working with it. So I've got the extreme highlights, middle tones, and it's sort of the same process, right? Then at the end there, for where all these bushes are at, I end up having to cut out all those vines and put them on a different layer because the color space needed to be different. They weren't really working too well for me. There we go. So there's my big old layer of all my vines. This is what I had within this section previously, only I think it was just like flat grass. So I needed to tighten up and darken up the grass space under here. You can see just how bright it was. And yeah, there's a lot that I added to it, which I'm fine with the bright ground that did stick into the painting because it gives little highlights about where the light would be able to penetrate through. So doing the dark on top of that worked pretty well for me. All right, so there's my minuscule highlights on the trees in the background. There's all my tree layers together. I really fought a lot on how dark to go with this particular tree branch here. For a long time throughout the composition, I just didn't like the shape of it. I thought it was pretty boring. I didn't really like the way these branches were going on here. So I worked these tree sections an awful lot to be able to get them to a spot where I was happy with them. And I felt like I was getting overwhelmed because I had these 3 trees, and that's okay to feel like you're getting overwhelmed. That's the fun part of doing these digital paintings, is that it's problem solving, right? You've got to mentally work through this stuff. You're thinking about the lighting. What do you want your final focus to be? How does the lighting, work on these trees compared to these smaller trees that we have elsewhere within the painting? How am I going to get from these brown sort of blackish trees into this purple tree that I know I've got to do in the front? And then how do I kind of work those colors together throughout the illustration so that they don't look like they're just isolated in one section? That's a great point. So if you are working on these paintings and you introduce this type of purple, make sure that you're using some of this purple elsewhere. If it's just all located in one little right-hand corner, it's not going to look right? You got to bring those particular hues through the rest of your piece. You can see that purple is getting worked into the water as well. It's getting worked into the lower left-hand side over here, just to be able to create some balance while I'm building this painting out. All right, so yeah, I don't know how many layers I ended up with on this thing. Probably around like 100, something like that. All right, we'll leave those trees on. All right, so this is a cool one. This is me trying to fill up this grassy space over here. 1, 2, and 3, 4. There it goes. So there's my big old grassy space. This was really bright here previously. I did like the way that I was kind of rendering this really softly, but the way that I built this was I started in the front with really dark foliage and leaves. And then from there, I started working backwards. And man, this is such a cool part about working digitally, is that, you can work above and below these different spaces. So I started building in the dark, super dark color. Then I went to a medium color. And then after that, I did sort of some lighter little pieces. And then I added some rocks just because I knew this was much later on in the painting. This is not kind of all in sequential order. So I'm working on these in regions. You can think of this as a region up here in the top right-hand side. This is a region within this section. This underneath the cliff ended up being its own thing. Behind the snake statue was a big region that I had to go in and work quite a bit. This tree line and working within this section up over here, and then this left-hand side was its own kind of region as well. This fauna, this transition space over here coming from behind the cliff down to the grass. What does that transition look and feel like? That was another thing like that I'm kind of working through in big old sections while I'm working on this painting. All right, so there's my grassy section there. Leave those guys up. Again, starting to just deaden some of that space because there's just too much contrast going on. There it is. There's the big one. Waterfall. That was in there before, so I'll leave it up. All right. Yeah. And then going in and starting to put some of the micro details on the snake. Man, what to say about that? That was an interesting process of, again, trying to... I knew I needed contrast because the snake was going to be coming out of the shadows in the back, but it still needed to have different colors. I needed moss on it. I needed details to be able to show through. So this was just a lot of working this area, right? So previously without this green layer on it, I felt like, I wanted to continue to push this part forward, and all of it was balancing out. There wasn't enough shadow happening on the right-hand side where I didn't really want the left-hand side where I didn't want the shadow to hit. And I wanted it to, this part behind the snake's head, to feel like it was in a little bit more shadow as well. So that's really what this green layer is trying to accomplish. It's just taking down some of that contrast and muddying it up. All right, so with all that, yeah, just kind of dove into the water on layer 10 here and just started painting the heck out of the snake's head, trying to use some of those other colors from my reference images. And I did quite a bit of work to be able to get it to look like it's fading into the shadows, to where it's got softer edges around some of these sections on it. But we'll leave that up. Wow. Yeah, that's my base color for the snake. So here's a layer of just a bunch of highlights going on within the top region. This is probably something that you didn't even notice before because it's so far back there, but without it, this top rim just gets lost. It doesn't have enough detail or rhythm to it, and I still need to have that lighting sort of breaking through the piece. So I went through same deal that I did down here with all these dark plants, and did a light version of it so it looked like there was still a bunch of foliage that was building up right up to the edge of this cliff face, and that was pretty important for me to go through and do. There it goes. Yeah, that's what my cliff looked like before. Pretty bare. And so that's something I would recommend that you guys do, is after you go through and get your basic shapes into your paintings, think about, especially for these jungle paintings, how you can go back and add details and create these areas of transition, right? That just felt a little bit too barren for a jungle scene for me. So I wanted to go in and add a whole bunch of little contrast that was happening. And I also used that fog color, that same fog trick that I'm using at the back of these trees. So we'll leave those on for now. Now let's turn it off. There we go. Some more of that big lighting coming in from the top. There's just too much contrast that was happening within this space for something that is that far away. So I wanted to soften it. Same thing is happening here. Just, they're interesting tree forms or rock forms or whatever the heck they are, but they were just demanding too much attention and they're too far away. So you can see me lessening those. Some micro highlights for underneath the cliff. More of me painting in that cliff face and trying just to work it like a piece of clay to get that to work the right way. Alrighty. So that's going to pretty much bring me back to where I was when I stopped the last video. I hope that this was useful for you guys. This is my line drawing from the very get-go on this thing. So from that initial thumbnail sketch, figure out where I wanted the snake to be. I knew I wanted this tree to be here. I had some foliage in the back, in the foreground, this cliff face. All the major elements stayed throughout this entire painting from that really quick thumbnail that I did. And then got us to the final piece, which turned out, I think, pretty cool. All right, let me show you guys the final one more time. waiting for it to open. There we go. Yeah. So breaking down all those layers, there's a lot of thought that goes into this. Final thoughts, keep on working the regions. Think about this section up here, how all the lighting is working together. When you feel like you got it to a final stage, then turn it into black and white. Make sure that, you're pushing the viewer's attention to where you want it to be. Is your painting working within black and white? Is there too much stuff that's bright? And, is it working with that 70-30 rule to where we are pushing the viewer's attention to the part that you actually want them to see? And then, even though I've got a ton of detail that's happening within all these spaces, right? It's much darker. It's got a lot less, differential between the super brights and the darks that we're seeing right here, right? So there it is in color. And I hope that this has been useful for you guys to see this pretty massive jump between where I left off the last video. I thought this was important to go back and talk to you guys about. And yeah, there's a lot of good thought, and that's one of the funnest, most interesting parts of doing these digital environment paintings. Is it is always a really cool puzzle for you to be able to solve. Enjoy that discovery process of having the idea in your head, holding on to it, making the decisions, thinking about the lighting, thinking about the forms, think about how you can push back the stuff within the extreme background, the far middle ground, the middle ground, and then the foreground, to be able to really separate out those different planes with the atmospheric perspective. Especially for these jungle paintings, fog is your best friend. And for you guys, I know this is a lot to take on, so this is sort of a good spot for you to throw everything, all the tricks that you have within your bag at this first project. And then we'll have a lot of good stuff to be able to talk about and move forward from there. So thank you so much for watching this, and I can't wait to see what you come up with.